Hi everybody, I'm Frederico Freitas, a historian of Latin America. Today, I'll talk about my new upcoming book, Nationalizing Nature, Iguazu Falls and National Parks at the Brazil-Argentina Border, which will be published by Cambridge University Press in the spring of 2021. Nowadays, about 1/4 of all the land in Latin America has been set apart for nature protection. It is a vast amount of land that Latin Americans have put under different types of environmental protection regimes, preventing them from being used for commodity production, for mining, from all sorts of very destructive economic activities. In this way, studying the origins of the Latin American environmental protection system is crucial to understand the region's economy, society, politics, and environment. My book, Nationalizing Nature, investigates the origins of national parks in two of the largest countries in the region, Brazil and Argentina. To do so, the book focuses on two of the first national parks created in the region. The Iguazu National Park, Parque Nacional Iguazu in Argentina, created in 1934, and its namesake, Iguazu National Park, Parque Nacional do Iguazu, created by Brazil in 1939. The two parks were named after their most important attraction, the Iguazu Falls, a 1.6-mile long system of cascades that forms one of the largest waterfalls in the world. The Iguazu Falls are located on the Iguazu River, which forms the boundary between Brazil and Argentina. Indeed, the falls are shared between the two countries, with a significant section belonging to Argentina and the rest located in Brazil. Although the parks share the same name and the same waterfall, they are entirely separate from each other. They are divided by the international boundary separating the two countries and are independently managed by each country. Even to this day, collaboration between rangers from the two parks is minimal. In fact, one of the things that I demonstrate in my book is that the parks were created in response to each other, in a sort of a national parks arms race, where policymakers in Brazil and Argentina would react to developments across the border and pressure their own government to create the national parks. The 1930s, when the two parks were created, were a decade of increasing nationalism in the entire region, in the entire Latin America. And geopolitics framed the way that politicians in Rio and Buenos Aires would look at this borderland. This was an area that in colonial times had been disputed by the Spanish crown and the Portuguese crown, and continued to be disputed by the countries that came after independence, by Brazil, Argentina, and Paraguay, which is also located close in this borderland. By the early 20th century, the boundary lines that defined this region had already been set by treaties. However, politicians in Brazil and Argentina feared that the excessive number of foreigners from neighboring countries could compromise their grip of their side of this borderland. At a time, there was a lot of movement crossing borders in this area. In Brazil, for example, Argentine businessmen would penetrate the Brazilian territory to harvest yerba mate and harvest and log the forests of the Brazilian banks of the Paraná River. In Argentina, Brazilians of German descent entered the Argentine territory purchasing, acquiring land or squatting land. So the Brazilians and Argentines who were proposing the creation of these parks in the 1930s understood them as tools to nationalize their side of the borderline. They wanted to use the parks to control this borderland and to make their side of the border either Brazilian or Argentine. Therefore, the two national parks would serve a contradictory set of goals. On the one hand, they would protect the forests and the waterfalls and this area for future generations, which is the traditional goal of national parks. On the other hand, they would establish infrastructure to attract colonists to settle in this area. And using a national park to settle people in a place, for example, to settle Argentine farmers at the Argentine side of the border, was a unique feature of conservation in these countries. You don't see that normally. Usually, parks are created as a check on colonization. And as you probably noticed, these two goals, protection of nature and colonization of the borderland, are opposites. They don't go together. You cannot protect nature from destruction, forests from being cut, at the same time that you're bringing migrants to settle in the same area. And this was the contradiction at the heart of the policy of using national parks to nationalize a border area that we see in my book. This contradiction between nature protection and frontier development would be the defining feature of these national parks for the next 40 years until a paradigm shift came into place. The first two chapters of my book are dedicated to showing how Brazil and Argentina used these parks as tools in frontier colonization. Argentina took the extreme path of promoting colonization inside the lands that it had set apart for the creation of its national park. They did that by introducing a new national park law in 1934 that established that every national park, which they envisioned would be created in frontier regions, would set apart a section of their lands for colonization purpose. So the new National Park Agency would be responsible for establishing colonies inside their national parks and establishing all the infrastructure to attract settlers, including hospitals, sanitation, schools. So inside the Argentine Iguazu National Park, the Argentine National Park Agency created a town today called Puerto Iguazu, and it started to sell parcels of land to settlers. And at the same time that the National Park Agency was settling settlers in one section of the park, in another section of the park, they were protecting the forests. They set apart that area for nature protection. The contradiction between nature protection and colonization was evident to most people at the time, including agricultural engineers who were very critical about this idea. But they were at the time a minority voice, and the main policy of the National Park Agency was to promote these two things side by side: nature protection and colonization. Across the border, Brazil also used its own Iguazu National Park to promote border colonization. Brazilians, however, did not put settlers inside their national park, at least not on purpose. They did so because, among other things, they already had a town nearby, a town called Foz do Iguaçu. But they used national park funding to finance a series of infrastructure works in the nearby towns, in the area outside the Iguazu National Park. Things like an airport, schools, hospitals, hydroelectric power plant, all sorts of things that they used to create roads. They used to create the conditions to attract settlers to the borderland, to do the same that the Argentines were doing across the border. So both Brazil and Argentina established parks in this borderland area, in this frontier area in the 1930s, as a way to attract migrants from their heavily populated eastern Atlantic seaboard. In the 1970s, however, a paradigm change led the military dictatorships in Brazil and Argentina to evict the people who are living in these national parks, which highlights the complicated relationship between authoritarianism and conservation in the Southern Cone. The book's next two chapters investigate how these two parks, who were first envisioned as tools of frontier colonization, became sanctuaries of pristine nature devoid of people. In Argentina's case, as I already said, the Argentine Iguazu National Park established a town in a corner of the park away from the Iguazu Falls. The Argentine National Park Agency also allowed a small number of workers to settle close to the Iguazu Falls. These were people working at the park hotels as cleaners, cooks, waiters. The goal of the Argentine National Park Agency was to colonize the border, these sections of the park, with what they envisioned as model Argentine citizens. However, things are revealed to be more complicated, as the people who moved to the parks did not fit that model. Sometimes because they were not born in Argentina, many of them were European immigrants, sometimes because they didn't fit this model of nuclear family with a legally sanctioned marriage, or because they were too poor or have destructive habits like drinking. But as the first generation of national park officials retired in the 1960s, these people who were against this idea of using parks as colonization tools grew to become a majority within the National Park Agency. And at the same time, in an international level, international organizations like the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, started to propose a standardized model of national park that envisioned national parks as spaces devoid of people. These two things progressed together, and it came to a point when officials at the National Park Agency decided that it was a time to evict all the people who were living inside the national park. But their biggest challenge was to do with Puerto Iguazu, the town that they had created in the 1930s, and by the 1960s had already 3,000 people living in there. They thought that would be a big problem, a big issue to destroy the town and evict people, so they came up with a different solution. Instead, they decided to retrace the boundaries of the national park to separate the town from the park. So by retracing the boundaries, the town will no longer be part of the park. Across the border in Brazil, things were even more complicated. As you might remember, in the beginning of the video, I said that the Brazilian National Park officials decided not to put people inside their national park. This, however, did not prevent people from entering the park and squatting land inside the Brazilian park. The decades following the creation of the Brazilian National Park saw a massive migratory movement of farmers coming from southern Brazil to this border area, to the Brazilian side of the border. These were mostly farmers of German and Italian descent, white Brazilians who moved to this area in search of cheap land. And what they found at the borderland was a land market rife with fraud and violence. And in the middle of all this, they also found this huge protected area, the Brazilian Iguazu National Park, that had been set apart from nature protection and was covered by forests. To complicate things, the lands that had been used in the creation of this national park had been disputed by the state of Paraná, where the park was located, and the Brazilian federal government. The dispute continued for years and years until it was solved by a ruling by the Brazilian Supreme Court in the 1960s. But until then, the situation of the lands inside the Brazilian National Park were not certain. So people didn't know exactly who owned the public lands that had been used in the creation of the park. That gave the opportunity for shady speculators, land speculators, and realtors to start selling land for settlers inside the national park. It got to a point in 1970 where you have 2,500 settlers living inside the Brazilian National Park. These people had built a life there. They had farms, roads, schools, churches, villages, even like soccer teams. So the fourth chapter of my book, Nationalizing Nature, covers the process of removal of the settlers from the Brazilian National Park. And this happened at the height of the Brazilian military dictatorship, when the Brazilian government employed authoritarian methods to remove people from the park. In the end, the military dictatorship managed to remove everybody. Those who tried to resist were threatened with arrest and torture. And today, the area previously occupied by settlers is covered by forest. There's little trace of their presence there. They removed all the houses, they removed all the buildings, and they reforest the entire area. So there's little, if you go there and you see the area, there's little indication that there are people living there 40, 50 years ago. So the traces of the presence of settlers inside the Brazilian National Park was erased both by nature and in the official discourse of the national park. The national park doesn't talk about that fact. One of the things that really interested me when I was writing this book was the actual process through which a national park becomes a national park. In the case of the two Iguazu National Parks, the Argentine Iguazu National Park and the Brazilian Iguazu National Park, this is even more important because unlike many other parks in Latin America, these two parks were never paper parks. Paper parks are parks that exist only on paper, and they're very common throughout Latin America. You have paper parks in Brazil, and the Amazon, and in other countries in Latin America. But the two Iguazu parks were never paper parks. If you go on Google Maps and look at satellite images of the Brazilian Iguazu National Park, for example, you will see a stark contrast between the dark green formed by the forest inside the park and the mosaic of farms and crop fields outside it. We know that the two parks were created in the 1930s to nationalize the border. And because of that, settlers were brought to live inside these national parks. In the 1970s, the military dictatorship in the two countries removed the settlers from these national parks. But the two parks also had large territories that were never settled by farmers, were never settled by migrants. How did they manage people from squatting these sections of these parks? In the last two chapters of my book, I tried to answer this question by changing the scale I used to analyze the two parks. In chapter 5, I look at the daily operations of the parks on the ground level. And in chapter 6, I look at an entire borderland region from above, from space, using satellite images and aerial images. So in chapter 5, I follow park rangers in these two parks as they move through the territory of the parks to fight hunting and logging. Because the parks are divided by the international boundary between Brazil and Argentina, any conflict between rangers from one side and hunters from the other side had the potential to become a minor diplomatic issue. And there were clashes indeed that sometimes became violent. In the sources, park rangers in Argentina are always accusing the Brazilian settlers living inside the Brazilian park of crossing the border to poach in Argentina. They would argue that the Argentine legislation was too lenient, attracting Brazilians to poach across the border. The problem is that although many primary sources describe conflicts between Argentine park rangers and Brazilian hunters, there are only a few cases where people were actually arrested. So I started to question my sources, thinking that maybe the people who wrote those reports, the park rangers, they were biased by the nationalist ethos of their jobs. To test whether or not I could trust my sources, I decided to map all the poaching cases reported by the Argentine park rangers between 1960 and 1980. If Brazilians were the culprits, removing the settlers from the national park in Brazil across the river would affect the spatial distribution of poaching cases across the border in Argentina. And indeed, I identified a change in the spatial pattern of poaching that happens after the Brazilian settlers are evicted from the Brazilian park. The poaching cases in Argentina, they move south away from the border with Brazil. So my finding in the end corroborates the claim made by Argentine park rangers that the culprit of these poaching cases, these poaching violations, were mostly the settlers living across the border in the Brazilian park. Finally, in the book's last chapter, I use a wealth of satellite images and aerial images produced between the 1950s and the present to investigate how these parks affected the environment of the borderland. I do so by first using historical aerial images to reconstruct the landscape of the park and the areas surrounding the park in the 1950s before the arrival of settlers in this area, in the 1980s after the arrival of settlers in this area. Later, I also had access to Corona satellite images, which were images produced in the 1960s by this spy satellite program. I found an image of this borderland area from the late 1960s. So I georeferenced these images, I traced the types of land cover for each period, and I made an analysis and comparison between each period. Overall, I confirmed that the parks had a powerful effect in not only protecting nature from the waves of migrants who were moving into this area, but also recreating nature in the case of the farmers and settlers who were removed from the park and in areas where eventually the forest regrew. Another very impressive thing that can be seen with these images is the clear-cut juxtaposition of different types of land cover, forest inside the park, and the mosaic of farming lands outside the park that were formed throughout the years as colonization happened outside the parks and nature protection happened inside the parks. To sum up, this was a brief overview about the content of my book, Nationalizing Nature. The book has much more information about different aspects of the parks. It also discusses in depth some of the concepts that I mentioned in this video. The book will be out in May 2021. If you have any questions, you can contact me via Twitter or email, both of which you can find in the description of this video below. Thank you.